Welcome, everybody, to our live stream. I'm Stuart Reigeluth, REVOLVE's founder. I'm joined today by Lea Ranalder. It's very nice to have you with us, Lea.
Thanks for having me.
Calling in from Paris, as I've understood. Today, we're going to be talking about the energy transition with a focus on renewables in cities, which is an original angle because usually, we're talking about renewables on offshore wind farms, or we're talking about solar panels in a desert, or we're talking about hydro in some mountains. And today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Lea, and who's the project manager and analyst at the esteemed Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century, also known as REN21, which everybody is probably most familiar with. She's also the coordinator of the new report on cities and renewables that we'll hear about in a minute. I wanted to share some previews into the number 40 of REVOLVE Magazine, which is coming out today as we speak, coming hot off the press. And we've partnered with different associations, including REN21, of course, but also with Energy Cities that provided this very nice photo essay on renewable energy projects in different cities as well. This is coming from a long collaboration with our colleagues in Brussels and at Energy Cities. This we've also worked with our colleagues from DecarbEurope. This is the friends from Aplia, and our own article about jobs and SMEs, which I encourage you guys to read up on. And we will be adding the link in the respective chats of this live stream. It's going through Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube, so you can pick it up on the different channels there. We have a wonderful feature by our colleagues at ResCoop on the power of co-ops and the importance and emergence of greater gender equality in renewable energy communities. And of course, the focus today is renewables and cities. And here you can see a glimpse of this wonderful article that came in from Lea Ranalder. Cities, game changers in the fight against global emissions and air pollution. Lea, thank you for joining us. Cities, of course, are growing, and humanity's presence in urbanizations are growing. We all know the fact that the UN's been putting forward that some close to 60% of humanity is now going towards the urban areas and increasing. So I wanted to ask you very simply, why do we need cities for the energy transition? What's their role here?
Well, thank you, Stuart, and a big congratulations from my side for putting out this fantastic magazine. I mean, it looks amazing. I'm really excited to read up on the content. To come back to your question, I think the one point you already summarized quite well, which is more than almost 60% of people live in cities. Cities are high impact areas. There is population growth, growing urbanization, and with that, of course, also comes growing energy consumption. And cities are now responsible for around 75% of global final energy use, and also a similar amount of CO2 emissions. So, and I think, you made also the link to the UN. Antonio Guterres said pretty much cities are where the climate battle will largely be won or lost. If we cannot get cities on board in this energy transition, in this fight against climate change, we'll have it will be very difficult to get there. So I think just as a start that they are high impact areas. And then I think the second big thing for me is always, we speak about the energy transition and we speak about we hear about these record installations of renewables. We hear that last year renewables had another record year, and that's fantastic news. Don't get me wrong, that's really great. But this is only speaking about the power sector. So, I mean, where renewables are indeed going very strong, but we consume more than 80% of our energy in heating, cooling, and transport, and renewables are lagging behind there. 80%. First of all, nobody speaks about that. I mean, the focus is very much on electricity, but also we can use cities to decarbonize heating and cooling and transport. Half of the heating demand is in buildings. Guess where most buildings are located? In and around cities. And here, heating markets are incredibly decentralized. So there is a need for having local solutions. And city governments, cities, people living in cities have a great role to play here. And if we look at transport, of course, it's also about reducing the energy demand in transport. It's about improving public transport, improving walkability, bike infrastructure, and of course also shifting to renewables-based public transport. So I think cities can really be our allies in making sure that we have renewable energy in all sectors and not only in the power sector.
Great. So you mentioned public transport, and we do a lot of work with UITP as well. And our next issue of Revolve is actually focused on sustainable mobility. And we're looking to have a great photo essay on public transport initiatives from around the world that are standing out, that are going towards zero emissions. So keeping with the theme of cities in relation to transport as well, I suppose, but more specifically about renewables, which is what your latest REN 21 report is. If we could add a link to that in the chat as well, it'd be wonderful for our viewers to pick up on that. Lea, tell us, concretely, how can cities drive and really accelerate the energy transition? As I introduced before, we often hear of, the big wind farms offshore, the big solar plants in the desert, or big hydro. How can cities actually get this going more?
Well, I think first, fantastic that you're doing an issue on sustainable transport. I think that's a really important angle to take, and also can serve as inspiration for other cities to pick up on and facilitate that shift to sustainable public transport. So I'm excited about that, just as a side note here. And then I think we've seen cities taking leadership in a variety of ways. First, I think it's really important to also understand why they're doing that, because they're seeing it as an opportunity. We always speak about renewables as a solution for climate change, but renewables are much more. They really are an opportunity to provide healthy, livable, clean cities. And that's ultimately what it is about. And that's how renewables can also contribute to this change. And city governments, they're really close to their residents. Residents are wanting to see change. They want to live in healthy urban environments. And I think this has been a real game changer. So also, that's why this also the title saying it's fight against emissions, but also against air pollution. Air pollution is such a major topic. Nobody wants to live in a place where there's massive air pollution. It's about their kids' health. It's about their own health. It's about a good life, so to say. So I think that's also just to say that they're major drivers for change. And now to come back to your question on what cities are doing, I think, first of all, our big headline was when we did the research, we crunched the numbers, we saw that there's approximately 1 billion people living in a city that either have a renewable energy target or a policy. So that's already 25% of the urban population globally. So I think that's, just taking that by itself is already means that there's some action happening. And if we see the concrete ways, it's on the one hand, we see city governments setting targets for renewable energy, but also this massive push for net zero. And I think it's really clear that it's going to be very, very difficult getting to net zero without scaling up renewables. So I'm, seeing all these plans and master plans now coming out, it's really interesting to see how city governments are integrating renewables into this, into their net zero strategies. And then also So we see targets, renewable energy, net zero, electric mobility targets. So I think, here the link to your next edition. But then also we see cities leading by examples. By example, procuring renewables for their own municipal operations, installing often solar PV in their own buildings or alongside their buildings, really integrating renewables into their public transport. But then I always say, it's great if a city government does that, but, it's not only about what they do for their own municipal operations, but a city is much more than just its government. So we also have seen city governments thinking about how they can get everybody who is living in their city part of this transition. So we've seen city governments put out renewable energy policies, financial incentives, also some cities who make it now mandatory that if you build a new house, you need to put up solar PV or solar thermal. So I think these things are really that stuff that's going to make the needle move. And specifically to pick up on this last point, they can, they're much closer to their residents, so they can make use of that. They can engage them in the urban energy planning. There are some cities, I'm based in Paris. Paris has given some roof space to community energy projects because densely populated city having roof space here will be incredibly difficult, but the city can facilitate that. And then, of course, also let's not underestimate the role that cities play in pushing national governments. Really, we've seen city governments coming together in networks. We've seen them coming together on a national level. For example, in Japan, many cities had committed already to net zero and pushed the national government. And then in the end, also that has been one of the major factors why the national government then also committed to net zero. So I think there's different angles and entry points where city governments can play a massive role.
Yeah, that was a complete answer. I was thinking as well, I was listening to you, to what you mentioned about the clean air, the importance of clean air. And it made me think of when I heard Schwarzenegger speaking a few years ago at one of these COPs. And he said, it used to be about tobacco and now it's about clean air. And so it used to be an anti-tobacco campaign against smoking and, inhaling toxins, basically. And now it's about spinning it towards, we want clean air. We don't want the negative side, we want the positive side, right? And we've seen this proliferation of city networks, and including our own, that REVOLVE has helped start, called Cities for Forests, which is very much about connecting citizens with nature. But we're not the only ones. Cities with Nature is another one, led by the Germans and ICLEI that you're probably familiar with. And then there's the C40s and the Euro cities, and then there's the regional level that's coming in. So we're seeing more and more what you said about needing to, or being in that advantageous position of being closest to the citizen and the resident. But also it's a double-edged coin or sword. The officials need to respond now to citizens and residents wanting clean air. So there's this movement in that direction, and if they don't go with it, then they're out of office. It's as simple as that. So there's no really either or anymore.
Just to pick up on one thing. Sorry,
go ahead.
Just mentioned. I think the point of spinning these positive images so important. Giving people a vision of how a life in a city could be without the pollution, without all the cars on the road. I think that's really important, so that it's also not, this transition is not about taking stuff away from people, but positive images of how their life could be maybe even better with the cleaner air and more space for, walking, sitting, cafes, safely riding your bike and so on. So also creating that visual in people's heads.
Absolutely. And to give you some background on REVOLVE, we started some years ago with some public information campaign / photo exhibitions called Visualizing Energy. And the concept was very much to show the humans behind the energy transition. So to show men and women in action on renewable energy projects across the board, from solar to wind to geothermal to etc. The closer you get towards energy efficiency, the more abstract or difficult it becomes to visualize. So that's where showing it in a city's context is actually not as easy as one would hope. But so I wanted to get to, of course, it's nice. We agree. I mean, based on what we're saying, that yes, let's show the positive. Let's move in that direction. The tricky part is actually implementing it. So what kind of support mechanisms? I mean, you alluded to some of them before, but you dive in a bit more and give some detail into what kind of support mechanisms would really help both the cities implement locally, but also potentially influence above, let's say, at the more national level.
Yeah, I think you're alluding to a very important question. I mean, I speak about cities, but let's be honest. I mean, cities cannot do it by themselves, right? I mean, we cannot just say, "Oh, let the cities handle it. We'll be fine. We're out. The cities got it under control," so to say. So I think there is definitely a need to think about how we can support city governments in facilitating that change. And we still, as inspirational as all of this is, we need to get going. We need to be even faster. So there is an urgency also. And I think one thing is, of course, I alluded to it already in the beginning, is the policies. Mm-hmm. Policy frameworks. I mean, look, we've heard about, there's cities that I've spoken to, some cities that said, well, we are trying to put in these policies, but what we are trying to do clashes with the national policies. So there is really a need to make sure that it is aligned, or that we are trying to do something, but we're not allowed to do it. So I think there is definitely a need for city governments to sit together at the table with national governments and think, okay, where are the different responsibilities? So for national governments also to realize that they can build on cities to achieve their goals. I mean, I think it's, we see all these national governments having net zero goals, but they're not going to get there without cities, right? So they need to also think how they can strategically build on the capacities and the strengths that cities have to make that transition happening. And then I think there's also, so aligning policy frameworks, making sure that there's nothing contradictory, but that is rather supplementary. And then the second thing is money. I mean, let's be honest. We need, money is what you need to realize all of these projects. And many city governments actually don't even have access to borrow in their own national markets. So how are they going to be able to realize these projects if they don't have the money to do so? So I think there is a need for also national governments, but also international organizations to think about how they can work with cities, helping them to make that business case, helping them to get the money in to realize these projects on the ground, so to say. And then I think also this idea of national governments can also see cities kind of like as a hub of innovation, trying out stuff locally on the ground, helping them to design and implement it, and then have a culture, a bit of experimentation, and then foster and scale it up if it works well. I think there are so many synergies that can be exploited there that are really important to also line out and exploit. And I think above all, it's really this understanding that city governments need to understand themselves that they have a role, and then national governments thinking that they can build on cities and understand that also local action means achieving national goals and international goals. I think that's a really important point here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that was quite complete. And I'm looking at the renewable energy policies in cities from your report, and I'm impressed by the early figures here of over 1,000 policies in close to 800 cities worldwide. So there is some baseline now. There is some movement in that direction, which is extremely positive, as you mentioned before. If hopefully the viewers can still see what I'm sharing here from your feature, Lea, you have a couple of examples from different parts of the world where things are happening. We have Chile here, we have Germany, Heidelberg, of course, Adelaide in Australia, Seoul in South Korea. So things are moving in the direction of integrating, renewable energy power into cities, so to speak. Give us some other insights that you may have from your research and from your work as an analyst. What are some other examples of, I hate to say good practices, but things that really stand out? I mean, you mentioned Paris, of course, before, but what else do you have up your sleeve?
Yeah, I think we always, it's interesting, in these examples and case studies, you always hear about the Copenhagen and Gothenburg and Paris, which
Right.
of course are doing fantastic things. Don't get me wrong, huh?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's great, but I think there's a lot more cities that do great things. And what I found actually really interesting in doing this research is that the majority of cities with targets and policies are actually rather the small and medium-sized cities. But we don't hear about them so much because, you might not necessarily recognize that name. So, just to say that there's a lot of small and medium-sized cities with fantastic, fantastic action. Just to name a couple, Berkeley in the US in 2019 became one of the first cities that banned natural gas in new construction, and has since kind of like kickstarted a big movement towards that. And that's, of course, a policy that's not directly for renewables, but that's banning natural gas, and in this way has really kickstarted electrification and also on-site solar PV. So I think that's an interesting example to name. There's also, in the US now specifically, Aspen and Burlington, who've been running on 100% renewable electricity for years already. I mean, they've been doing this for years, and now there's others following suit. I mean, we've heard about Adelaide and Houston now also recently shifting to 100% renewable. So also bigger cities who are following this game, so to say. One of my really examples that I really like is Cape Town, because it kind of breaks with that myth that only cities in rich countries can do something. I mean, Cape Town has been doing lots of stuff around scaling up locally solar PV and solar thermal, working with disadvantaged communities, also to think about how they can provide energy access. And then a couple of years ago, they said, well, we want to procure our own electricity and we want to generate our own electricity. But it wasn't allowed from the national government. So they took the national government to court. And last year they won. And, this is now they're allowed to procure and to generate on site. And one of the big drivers was to go away from national coal-fired power. So I think just this decision by itself is going to have major implications throughout South Africa, but probably also throughout the wider region. And I find that, that's a really inspiring example. And then, of course, I also already mentioned this as well in this feature, is cities in Latin America are scaling up electric vehicle buses like crazy. I mean, I think Chile currently has the biggest fleet of electric buses outside of China. So that's pretty impressive. That's some fast change happening there. And I think we see cities following suit left and right, which is very inspiring.
Yeah, no, those are some great examples, and thanks for bringing up the aspect of the smaller and medium-sized cities that are actually leading the way, even though they're overshadowed by some of the bigger capitals. That's an important point. And you talked about the electrification of vehicles and mobility, and this is of course a very nice stepping stone towards our next issue of REVOLVE Magazine coming next September, as I said. But it also made me think of hydrogen, which I wasn't expecting to ask you about this, but I will in closing. Lea, hydrogen is this funny fuel, it's the most abundant gas in the universe or in our world, and yet we're starting to tap into it, right? Even though Jules Verne had prophesied about it back in the late 1800s as sort of the magic fuel that could be turned into water. We're seeing, ferries in Stockholm, for example, that are going to be fully powered by hydrogen by 2023. We're seeing pitchforks in warehouses for Colruyt, for example, here in Belgium, that use hydrogen-powered sources of energy. They're even spinning this word called hydrorenewables, it's called. It's being pushed by the hydrogen guys here in Brussels. What's your take on, I mean, more broadly on innovation? Of course, we want innovation, but how does hydrogen fit into the renewables in cities side of things?
Yeah, I think that's a very I would say hotly debated topic right now. The hydrogen
It is
one.
indeed. It is indeed. Tricky last question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm very happy with the tricky last question. I think you alluded to it already. Is how do we produce that hydrogen? I mean, currently 99% of it is produced with fossil fuels. So I think that's just we hear about, yes, green hydrogen, but currently it's less than 1%. And in the future, if we scale up renewable hydrogen production, great. But, that shouldn't be our target by 2050. That needs to happen really quickly. And then I think as a second thing, where my stand and also comes on that hype is there are sectors where hydrogen makes sense. The ones where it is incredibly difficult to electrify, the ones where other renewable energy sources are very difficult to integrate. I mean, long haul transport, as one example, industry might be another one. But I think there's also lots of hype around, okay, we can use hydrogen to heat our homes. For me, that's just a discussion that we should not have. I mean, that is just a waste of that fuel. I mean, heating our homes, we don't need high temperatures. There are a variety of other options available that are a lot more efficient, that are a lot cheaper, and that are going to get the job done a lot quicker as well. Heat pumps, district energy networks, solar thermal, just to name a few. So I think, yes, I guess hydrogen has a way in this energy transition, but let's make sure it's renewable-based hydrogen. And then also let's make sure that we use it in the sectors where we cannot use other renewables. And then I think as a last thing in cities, I mean, we've seen some cities thinking about how they can use hydrogen in their heavy transports. I mean, you named a couple examples, but I think we're still, I mean, from what we've been seeing, it's still very much baby steps that are happening here. Just a couple of handful of cities that are taking action there.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lea. Thank you for the reality check on hydrogen and the mention of heat pumps also as an innovative technology and solution for cities and heating and buildings, of course. Thank you for contributing to Revolve and for being with us today. And I encourage our viewers to visit the REN21 site to check out Lea's work with her colleagues on renewables in cities, if you want to get more details into that. Lea, thanks again for joining us from Paris, and I wish you a good day.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Same to you.
Bye-bye. Talk to you
Bye.
next time.